ערב טוב. תודה לכל מי שבא. That will be the last Hebrew words here this evening. I didn't know that we have so many Anglos in Ramban. Welcome all. And it is a privilege to invite our friend Yחיאל, Charles, to share with us his eyes witnesses. It's very interesting that every year we can see that the ages of the witnesses become younger and younger. And to be a child in the Holocaust is completely different eyes. And we are waiting. We need to take the whole voices of what we call the first generation. We have the responsibility, the obligation to take these voices, to put it strongly inside our heart, to have the possibility to share it with the next and coming generations. This is like mitzvah, mitzvat vehigadeta. When we use the word vehigadeta, it's not just the way how to share stories. The word vehigadeta, if you play with that in Hebrew, you can say it with aleph and not with hey, and then you go to the word vehigadeta, meaning you link, you make the kesher between the generation, the stories, and I hope that we are trying to do this mitzvah in the maximum that we can, and we for years, we trying to take voices from Keilat Ramban, and now it's the time of the last or the youngers of the first generation to stand and share with us their own story. So יחיאל, בבקשה ותודה רבה.
First, I'd like to apologize for not speaking in Hebrew. My vocabulary is not as rich as I would like it to be. My vocabulary is not as rich as I'd like it to be. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak in English. We pay a tribute and respect to the 6 million who died in the Shoah, and I dedicate my presentation to the memory of all the victims of the Shoah, and in particular, I want to dedicate this also to Zecher, my parents, Dov ben Aaron HaKohen, Yetli Bas Shlomo, and my two brothers, Aaron and Yosef Tzvi HaKohenim, who were murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. The survivors sharing their experience during the war, besides bearing testimony what happened in the war, also humanized the large 6 million figure which we cite as the number of victims in the Shoah. And by bringing it down to size, to families and to individuals, talking about 6 million individuals with names, each with hopes and potential to contribute to society. My story begins in 1935. I was born in Scheveningen, Holland, in a neighborhood of The Hague, adjoining suburb. The youngest in a family of 5 children. My parents originally came from Poland and Austria-Hungary and settled in Holland in 1922. My father was a wholesale postage stamp dealer. Stamp collecting was popular hobby in Europe, and he had a store in the house with my mother and oldest brother assisting, especially when my father traveled to postage stamp stores in Holland and in Western European countries, selling stamps, collecting supplies, catalogs, etc. Holland was invaded in May 1940. With the help of sympathizers, the Nazis consolidated control of critical sectors, the police, trains and trams, radio and communications, banks, newspapers, utilities, in order to gain control of their new captured country. The Nazis introduced anti-Jewish measures to make life difficult for the Jews. Jewish-owned businesses and stores were closed or confiscated. Jews were not allowed to travel outside of Holland. Parks were designated where Jews were allowed. Jewish actors and actresses were allowed to perform only to Jewish audiences. Jewish children were not allowed in public schools, only in Jewish schools. There were curfews. All of these measures were intended to disrupt the normal living for Jews and isolate the Jews from the public, preparing for the subsequent rounding up of Jews for deportation. Besides having to wear a yellow star with the word Yod, Jew, I was not affected by the above measures. At home, though, I did sense something amiss. There was more whispering by my parents and my older brothers. And while I started school, there was an air of uncertainty about schooling, a sense of a storm brewing, but I was not aware of the details or their significance. In mid-1942, the Nazis started rounding up Jews, and the Jews were told that they were going to the east to work in factories that the Nazis needed for their war effort. With the noose tightening, with Jews not allowed to leave Holland and foreign countries refusing entry of Jews, the Jews felt trapped. My father gave his valuable personal stamp collection and some of his postage stamp supplies to close non-Jewish acquaintances or friends for safekeeping. However, I want to say, no one showed up after the war to return his materials. In the fall of 1942, my parents were preoccupied trying to obtain travel documents from relatives in Switzerland. They decided to split the family, placing the three youngest of the family, my brother, my sister, and myself, in what was regarded as safe places: tuberculosis sanitariums, hospitals, orphanages, homes of pregnant or recently born babies, on the assumption that the Nazis would not send people from these places to the east. The splitting of the family occurred around the time we read Parshat Vayishlach, where Yaakov prepares to meeting his brother Esav. And if you recall the Pesukim there, Vayar Yaakov me'od, Vayetzelo, Vayachatz et ha'am asher ito, l'shnei machanot. Vayomer, im yavo Esav el ha'machaneh ha'achat v'hikahu, haya machaneh neshar lefleita. Yaakov was afraid and worried about what is coming up, and he divided his family units into two machanot, two camps, and he said in case Esav arrives in one and destroys it, the other one will be spared. I wonder whether Yaakov's strategy inspired our parents, but as it turns out, that this strategy saved our lives, my brother and myself. Conventional wisdom was that roundups took place in evenings, so people ventured out in the morning. My father picked up my brother and myself from the safe house in the morning to take us to Minyan. One morning he did not come to pick us up, and we were told that it meant that he and my mother and 2 older brothers most likely were rounded up. My last recall of my father was sitting on his lap while he was wearing his tefillin. I carried this image of my father, which to this day periodically flashes in front of me. After the roundup in early 1943, my parents and 2 older brothers were sent to Westerbork, the major concentration transit camp in Holland, located in northeast Holland, far away from the Dutch main cities. Soon thereafter, they were transported to Auschwitz, where they were gassed upon arrival. Our last contact from our parents was a postcard tossed out of the train to Auschwitz, telling us that they were on the way to East, reminding us that we had relatives in Switzerland, wishing us well, with our brothers adding the Hitraot. Now the 3 of us, Leo, my brother, 11, Lily, my sister, 9, and I, age 7, without parents, were on our own. We had to leave the safe house we were in and were transferred to an orphanage in Amsterdam. The Nazis rounded up all the Jewish orphanages and on February 11, 1943, sent all the children to Westerbork. Typically, new arrivals in Westerbork were shipped to Auschwitz or Sobibor or Bergen-Belsen, following the Monday evening, Tuesday morning of the following week. An outbreak of scarlet fever, however, a contagious disease, quarantined the orphanage barracks where I was located. We were located, and we were not included on the next train that went to Auschwitz. During the quarantine period, Honduran visas and passports for our family, acquired by our Swiss relatives at huge expense, arrived. All, unfortunately, came too late for my parents and brothers, just in time for us. The Nazis, eager to maintain their import sources for obtaining raw materials for their war effort, regarded Honduras as neutral, and this placed us in a special category. My brother, who at the age of 11 had the major task of representing us, quite an awesome assignment, was called in by the Gestapo, asked to come to speak to them. And he didn't know what to do, so he, as it occurred in the camps, people consulted who were regarded as knowledgeable. He consulted a Dutch person who happened to be a lawyer, asked, what do I say, what do I do? To know I was being called even. And he was advised to answer questions which he knew about, and if they ask about his relatives, say that he has relatives in Switzerland, which were correct, and say his father died, which turned out to be also correct. And the first question they posed to him was, do you speak Honduran? He didn't know that it was a trick question for that matter. And he mumbled something until he told me, and after that they dismissed. We don't know whether the Nazi inquisitor knew that Honduran was not a language. the Nazi management did not know what to do with us. 3 children, unattached, and they're here in that camp. And children were a nuisance for them because they couldn't ship them to work camps and to send kids to the death chamber on their own. They didn't do for some reason. And they had these Honduran passports to deal with. We were sent for 1 month or so to Amersfoort near Utrecht, part of a prison for political prisoners. The conditions were worse in Westerbork. We weren't told why, and the same way we arrived to that prison compound, we were shipped back to Westerbork. I remember little about Westerbork. It was basically a transition collection camp. People were collected and delivered and stood there for a short while, and they were then transported to death camps or Bergen-Belsen. I recall trains coming and going. That was the environment. I played with the son of the manager of the children compound, Dr. Jakob Birnbaum, who had come to Holland from Germany, a social worker. I had no schooling, and the time passed. Just to put this all in context, 75% of Dutch Jews were killed in World War II. The highest percentage of Jewish population in West European countries. The reasons for such a high percentage are several. The Dutch were very efficient, and the Germans cashed in on that. What happened was the dock workers, the longshoremen in Holland, worked to sabotage the Nazi control of Holland wherever possible, and one of their activities was to make life difficult for the Germans to deport the Jews or other people who were being deported. So they went to the Jewish Council and they managed to get the entire list of names of Jews and destroyed it. The Nazis were upset, apparently, and demanded for the Jewish Council to reconstruct the list. Because they were so efficient, they did it close to a perfect job. Contrast that with Belgium, which lost 40% of their Jewish population. And I don't hope I have Belgian citizens over here, but they had a reputation of being lazy and or so, and they did not reproduce that list as much. And that was the major reason, or the major explanation. In addition, they had a lot of Nazi collaborators in Holland, and they were helpful of enforcing the Nazi demand for the Dutch Jews to be captured, and they identified those who they didn't know exactly. In addition, the Nazis actually had a number of people, 50 or 60 or so I've read, who were hired by them to go, and they knew about people being hidden, to go around and identify Jews. And they were rewarded by a salary plus 7.5 guilders for each Jew who they captured. And the estimate is that 8,000 to 9,000 Jews who were in hiding were betrayed by these people.
Jews or non-Jews?
Pardon?
These people were Jews or non-Jews?
Who did it? Non-Jews, I assume. They were Jews. They were hired. They wouldn't have hired them. As they didn't know what to do with us, after a while, they decided to ship us to Terezin in Czechoslovakia. We were placed on a train to Terezin. We were assigned a woman, a social worker, Malka Weinmann, who was the person with whom the new authorities in Terezin could deal with if it relates to our situation. Terezin, Czechoslovakia, is around 60 kilometers from Prague. It was originally an army camp for the Czech army, which was also overtaken very early in the war, and it was a transit camp for the Czech Jews who were rounded up from throughout Czechoslovakia, and many of them were arriving in Terezin and they were shipped out. Later, it was designated for privileged prisoners like myself, for neutral country passports or distinguished Jewish personalities such as Leon Beck, the head of the leader of the Reform movement, Leon Blum, a former Prime Minister of France, Viktor Frankl, among others, author Lustig, and they had a lot of prominent musicians and artists who, for a variety of reasons, they designated as privileged prisoners, and use it for bargaining purposes in case they had to do so, or to show off to people who came to inspect the camp, the Red Cross, as I'll talk about. And it was eventually also used for propaganda, to regard this as a model camp, to show that all this news reporting, which was very little, by the way, of the bad conditions in the places where the Jews were placed, either to work or to be burned, is not correct. Overall, 140,000 people were deported to Terezin, half of which were the Czechs. 88,000 of those people were deported from Terezin. There were, so it's reported, 156 people died each day, some due to illness, others due to starvation or old age. Although the environment of Terezin was substantially better in terms of space and location than Westerbork, and certainly much, much better than the other camps, but there was certainly enough lacking. It was very primitive living there. It was crowded. The buildings which were used for the army for 7,000 Czech soldiers were now populated by 53,000 Jewish, primarily Jewish prisoners. Poor hygiene. They separated the men's section in the caserna where we were, and others I gather too, and women on the other side. We were placed on the third level bunk bed. I slept next to where my brother had a bed. We had straw mattresses and nighttime visitors, bed bugs. The nutrition was pretty poor. Everyone was given a metal bowl and a metal cup and a metal spoon to get their food at line-up time. And everyone was given a month, or had to gather their monthly ration meal card. And I was told by my brother, I don't believe it, and my sister, that they don't recall that I ever lost the card or the bowl, because no ticket, no meal. The menu was rather bleak. Morning we received black bread, ersatz coffee, the grounds of the coffee from the coffee made for the Nazi contingent there. String beans, they were called then, rather than green beans, and there were more strings than beans. Potato peels. A lot of the food that was left over from the Nazi dining room was given to us. Barley soup. Turns out that the barley soup, if one had to have a sense of what you're able to get and not get, you come at the beginning, you ended up getting water. If you came at the end, the pot was empty. Given that we were there for a year and a few months, we were streetwise, knew when to inch into the line and able to get barley soup or so. Twice a week, they honored the prisoners with meat, horse meat. We asked a shaila. We went to the local rabbis who were there, both Dutch and remaining Czechs, and they all told us, you eat in order to survive. The custodian was assigned taking care of the infant children. They had a special house for smaller children than we were, and they had a little better food for them, and she had the right to ask to include me into to join her quarters, especially since they had better food, including lard, chazir, fat. And here the same question was asked. I didn't want to go, in fact. I was told by her and others. And the rabbanim over there again told us, eat, or told me to eat. There was no formal education in Theresian, although the people who were after the adults who were there had work assignments, but either when they were not working or so, they gave their time and talents to educate the number of children who were there. And in the attic in the caserna where we were, we had classes, if you call them that, because different age brackets as well. And we covered discussion of Chagim, arithmetic, Israel map. And as far as I was concerned, Israel was in my backyard. I knew a straight line for the Yarden, one loop circle, another line, and a bigger loop circle, and the rest was desert. And that was my understanding of the map of Israel. They taught us songs, and two of the songs which I still remember. One was Sim Shalom, sung in the rounds. The other one was Shomer Yisrael, Shomer She'ez Yisrael. And I didn't know until I matured more of the selection of those songs to build up people's morale and hope, and certainly picked two of the right songs to teach us. They taught us about Chagim, but did not really practice the Chagim. They also had a guard. One of the private people served as the guard outside the attic, and when he saw the Nazi soldiers coming by for general inspection, including maybe looking for the teaching room, which was not allowed, he made some signal. Whoever was leading the instruction put whatever materials they had. We had no textbooks and notebooks, obviously, and we started playing games, and we were trained to do so. Reminded us, or reminds you all, of Hanukkah. I was a little freedom because I had to go from the caserna where I was sleeping, went to this custodian's building, and I walked around, and my game activity was playing soccer with ever the few little children who were there, but not a soccer ball, but with a metal can. I did not have many friends, although 15,000 children passed through Teresian, of which they claim only 100 or 150 children survived. But the children who did arrive were constantly staying there for a short period, and then they moved on with their parents when they were deported to Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. So I had no permanent friends. All I knew is whoever little boys, or girls for that matter, were around, I played with, but I had no toys, like we used to as children. There were two religious events, if you call it that. Well, one definitely was a religious event in Teresian while we were there. We did have a minyan in one of the buildings, which was the authorized one. There was another minyan sometimes in the building where we were, and they seemed to have allowed it to happen. And in fact, Leon Beck, with his black big kippah, davened with us. I know exactly where he sat, or so. I remember that one. And had a Sefer Torah, so we went for Shabbat to Minyan. But my brother had a bar mitzvah forthcoming, Parshat Vayero in 1945. So again, the people took care of us, our concerns, and they said, what do we do with this boy? So they taught him the Haftorah and the Maftir, from which he read. And then came the question about tefillin. There was no Mochaswarim in Teresian stuff. There was one prominent Jewish scholar who donated his second pair of tefillin, not Rabbeinu Tam, but they had he was in Europe, people used to travel, which was called travel tefillin, because when they did on business, they had a little suitcase when they traveled during the week on the train, and big tefillin take too much space, so they gave the tefillin, and they gave it to my brother, and that's one of the items it's not mine. I still have these tefillin. These were his tefillin. He passed away a year ago or so. As you'll see here are, just one, no.
You can see the size.
These are the size of the batim. Typically, these travel tefillin are not very reliable to be kasher because you have to roll them up very tightly in this little box and the ink disappears. After the war, it was inspected by a sofer, and he reported it was letter. I'm sorry. After the war, it was after the war. My brother brought it to a sofer, and it was declared letter perfect. The second religious event, if you could call it that, was in fact, there's a disagreement between my sister and my brother and myself, but it has a common element. Our version was that we saved our potatoes for several times, brought it to my sister, and asked her to make matzot, potato matzahs out of the potatoes. Her recollection was that we did give her potatoes to grind and to make something, but it was a birthday cake for her. And my daughter recently told me maybe we did it twice. And I remember each of that too. Oddly enough, I don't recall, nor did my brother, having matzot. Even at the end of the war, the Danish prisoners, they came late, there were a number of Danish prisoners, they did receive matzot because they were more involved with the Red Cross than we were. And they did not give it to us, or may not were allowed to give it to us. It was very surprising. On top of all of this description of life in Theresian, there were roll calls every day, concerned that people escape or just to make life difficult for us. And the Nazis also did not allow mingling with the different nationalities in Theresian. There was a group of Dutch. We had a special building called the Dutch quarters. There was a quarters for the remaining Czechs. There was a quarters for eventually the Hungarians who came late in the war, and the Danish. The only time we really met other nationalities was in the lineup for the roll call. We had rows to stand, and there was a fence and another nationality. So we met new people and picked up a little bit of the foreign language they spoke, and I learned the Igen for Hungarian or so, and I learned a little bit of Danish. But this was daily roll call, whether it was winter or rain, we were out there as well. The Nazis used Theresian as a propaganda tool. They invited the International Red Cross to inspect the camp, but before doing so, they remodeled one section of the camp and made cafe, soccer, football fields. Waitresses received nice uniforms, had a flower shop, and they picked up, they had concerts, the Requiem they played, and then a prominent children's play, W Bar. And the inspectors came and they were very enamored what they saw. and we got good grades for that. Nazis even made a propaganda film. And I don't have the quotation with me, but to add to their propaganda, they sent a press release out to whoever was getting it, describing of this beautiful visit and the beautiful town, how well the Jews are, while our soldiers fight and are deprived of all the niceties of life. Turns out, a lot of people asked me were you there at this event? Well, we arrived around in February 1944. A display of the scam took place in June, but they practiced to develop this gimmick for quite a while. We came too late for that. Moreover, we spoke a language that the Red Cross might understand, besides Dutch. A lot of the Dutch did speak German. But the Czechs did not, the Red Cross did not speak Czech. So they had only Czech youngsters there for this display, and the Red Cross fell for that and shipped the medicines in return. And the day the Red Cross left, the entire cast of this false display of beauty was packed up and shipped to Auschwitz. That Nazis did not want that this news comes out, should these survive. Meanwhile, some of the participants did write diaries, hid them, and they revealed all the details anyway. That's a nice difference. The next phase was that because of the visit of the Red Cross offered to take, the Germans wanted constantly assistance of things they didn't have, like medicines, and being couriers also for certain raw materials from Sweden, like ball bearings. And they offered to get this for the Nazi regime on condition that they release 1,000 people. And it was called a freedom train. And they had actually a call of people who would be eligible to go to Switzerland. And given that we had Swiss relatives, we were eligible. Again, we were advised by people that this is another scam. And we withdrew our eligibility, did not sign up, and the people who did go left with the following instructions from those who were remaining. If it is real, send us postcards with certain words. If it is not real, send us a postcard with a sentence or so with other words. And it turned out it was real. This was the end of, this was already in 1945. Then in succession, there were similar roll calls for another freedom train going. And this time we signed up, but we were rejected. Another time, on these last few months, there was another roll call. And before that, before the roll call, for the enlistment request, another time we actually were on the list to go, and not knowing about it, that train actually went to Auschwitz. We did not get on there because somebody behind the scenes went to the Jewish council head and implored them not to take these 3 little children or so, and we were not on that train. And finally, towards the end of the war, there was an assignment. People's names were put on. We were put on a list for going to the next train, which everybody thought is going to go to Auschwitz. By the way, people didn't know Auschwitz. All they knew was it can't be a point of no return. But we put on the list. That train was scheduled to go to gas chambers in Theresen. The Germans were running out of resources, trains, and other resources to bring people to the death camps. So they brought the gas to cylinders of gas to Theresen, and it turns out that we were supposed to go therefore to the gas chamber, but at that time the Germans were already abandoning the Theresen management, and the train never left, and therefore the gas chambers were never used. Towards the end of the war, we saw where we at lineup. We saw at lineup. We saw the Germans fleeing with the baggage on their backs or so, and the people were cheering them on. They sensed the war's ending, and when they looked at us, for good luck, they tossed a hand grenade, landed pretty close to us, did not open up, fortunately, as a farewell gift. While we were at the end of the war, at roll calls, then you had the experts who were identifying that the war is about to end, because earlier the sounds came from one direction. That was the German army during the year of the battles, and that was identified as German. Towards the end of the war, the sounds were coming closer and louder from the other direction, and people, the experts, quotation marks, of war decided that the army of the Allies are coming, and Kachaya, that's what happened. So we were liberated by the Russians, and May 9th, 1945, they arrived, and at that time already, many of the leaders of the Nazi army had escaped, and they had actually given over authority to the International Red Cross for the last few days or so. We didn't know about that either. But they left, and the Russians were uneven. They came in and they threw candies to the children who were there. And what happened, had candies after 2 years, was something new, 2.5 years, was something new for me. And some gave their food rations or so. At the same time, I saw one Russian soldier grabbing a watch from a woman who had survived, who had the watch as well. It most probably meant a lot to her, and grabbed it off her, and I learned later about the assaults that took place as well. So they were good and bad people like everything else. But they made the remaining German soldiers who were captured do the dirty work, keeping the place clean and cleaning it up, and that's how the war ended with the Russians. We also were lucky that we were liberated by the Russians, because once we were liberated by the British and the Americans, the generosity of giving food to people who were in starvation position did a lot of harm. A lot of people became fatally sick. People ate with enthusiasm and died, unfortunately, as a result of that. The Russian rations were very small and poor. So first they couldn't give much away, and whenever we prisoners got over there, so that was okay. Anyway, now comes the next stage. The war is over. What do 3 children do? No parents or so, and what happens next? and that's the next stage. I'll briefly talk about that and then I'll give some other reflections if I have the time. The people who were liberated could not leave Theresian because at the same time we were being liberated around that time, there were people who were on death marches when certain camps were closed in Europe, and they came even from those who were liberated from, not liberated, who were channeled to other places from Auschwitz or other places, other big camps in Eastern Europe or Germany. They went on death marches were called, because they were being transferred first by train, and the trains broke down, and then by foot to go to other camps, including people who were in Auschwitz and went then to a war camp, ended up in Theresian, but they had those who survived the death march, and many of them came with typhoid. And in order to the Russians' management now, in order that the surviving prisoners in Theresian don't catch typhoid, they put a closure. People couldn't leave. So the war was over in May, and people couldn't leave for a number of months. But one of the criteria of leaving was that you had a place to go. And we had no correct place. The custodian lady had a brother in Amsterdam. He was married to a non-Jew, and therefore, for some reason, he was not deported. And she had an address, so she put us on the list to go. So in end of June, I believe, we were taken to go to Amsterdam. But since Czechoslovakia was liberated half by the Russians, half by the British and Americans, you had to go to Amsterdam via the American-British location. So we were put on a train and to go to Pilsen from Theresian, where the other side was. And on that train, something which left a big impression on me, suddenly I saw one man open the window of the train and threw out his tefillin and yelled something, "If that is what religion is all about, I don't want it." Somewhat later in the train, another man yells, "Because I am surviving and saved, I'm going to start putting on tefillin." And my grandson asked me, why didn't they do this exchange? When I mentioned that at the time of my brother's Shiva, there were two independent times, prominent Rabbanim who were coming for the Shiva for my brother, and both of them, when I mentioned that story, says both were right. Anyway, that is the story of Theresian. We then had to go back to Holland with this custodian lady. We took an army aircraft from Pilsen to Holland. We were reunited with a relative in Amsterdam, a person who used to be a cousin of my father's, who had a restaurant in Amsterdam. They were in hiding for 2 years, 2.5 years or so. Their children were in hiding, but I won't go into much detail of the return in Holland because we're running out of time. But it's important to note that the return by people coming from the war, from all places, no longer not just from Theresian, from Bergen-Belsen, from other death camps or work camps, everybody was trying to reconstruct their lives. Some returned to family, some came home, their house was gone, their family was gone, and there was a tremendous amount of shuffling of what to do. Many people wanted to get out of Holland or out of Europe as fast as they could. Some went to the United States if they could. Some went to Canada. Some went to Australia. And some went to England. But they didn't like to stay in Holland. Too close memories of it. Others went into despair. And there was one case where, given the relatives where we stayed, lost their restaurant, but in the little apartment they took us in, former customers of the restaurant came to visit or even get a meal where feasible. And there was one man who was in such despair, he lost his entire family, and he came to consult my relative and says, I can't do it, I want to take my life. And my relative tried to reason with him and build up his morale. And I was there because the rooms were very small, they couldn't even close the rooms, so you hear all this stuff. And then later on, after a while, he didn't show up. I asked, where is he? And I was told that he did take his life. I had dreamed nightmares for that for quite a while. And down the line, I could tell you more detailed episodes of the difficulty of doing. But even there were two things which may be worth to share with you. After the war, everything was happening for people was the first time since the war. When they bought something, or sold something, or met somebody. But the first Chag, really, which we had, were the Yom Neroim and Sukkot. And for people that survived, it was a meaningful return. Others has survived and came just for the high holidays then already. But on Sukkot, they obtained one esrog and lulav, which was very common in European shuls anyhow. But the joy of making a bracha for the esrog and lulav was high. And people lined up and saying, I haven't done it for so many years. And it was real joy to perform a mitzvah. The first day was used, the second day it was used, and they decided the relatives with whom I stayed, lived around the block from the Beit HaKnesset, decided to bring the esrog and lulav to their little apartment for guarding it. In the afternoon, they went to take a nap. I was a little curious, a little boy of just, it was my birthday in fact, and I played with the esrog and lulav, and lo and behold, I broke the pitum. And I was pretty well disturbed by that. Next morning for Chol HaMoed, I was depressed, and I thought everybody's pointing at me, here's this boy who broke the pitum. Suddenly a man walks in, not a member of the little community we had there, wearing a gray suit and a bow tie. I've never seen a bow tie. Walks in with the esrog and lulav. Came from The Hague on business, and people were overjoyed to have a real esrog, and begged him to stay on if he could. He stayed on for the week. I was relieved, and to this day I think the Mashiach will wear a great suit and a bow tie. All the firsts taking place, I remember my first postage stamp, I remember my first ice cream, the pungent taste of vanilla, things I've never had or never. Then the question is, what do we do? Because this was a had other relatives in Switzerland, relatives in the United States, and on my father's side, an uncle, and my mother's side, an aunt and several uncles. And there was a sort of discussion of where do those children go. Each claimed that it's their eagerness to have us and to do good for us. Well, that's when you have two people fighting over, quotation mark, fighting over some object, they tried to divide. So the decision was to take my brother and me to the United States, better chinuch was the justification, and my sister go to Switzerland. To this day, my sister can't understand why that was allowed after the war for us to be separated. I still had to tell her each time it was destined for you to go, because there she met her husband in Basel. He was the leader of the Bnei Akiva group, which she had in Zurich, and they came to Aliyah in 1951. They were married, and they've had many happy years together, and that would not have happened in the United States. I said that I would also talk some reflections. Could I speak a few minutes more? One thing were lessons for me and maybe lessons for others as well. I learned quickly that being a survivor of the Shoah was not enough, because as I met other survivors, one also has to survive being a survivor. Number of people, because of the trauma of the war and what they went through, and many people went through different stages of problems that we had. The war experience was heavy, and they felt any of the shortcomings they have are due to the war. And they had grievances. They thought they're being attacked because they were being Jews, or they were not good, didn't have good accents. They had a lot of bitterness coming out of the war, maybe for very good reasons, but that's how it was. And I didn't think that is the way to go. Looking backwards and living a life with bitterness is not the way I'd like to do. And look forward to the future with more optimism, but maybe with more effort. And I was determined that I do not want to get into that category of do so. So in that respect, there's a difference of being a survivor, particularly children, because we didn't do anything on our own. It was not our wisdom, it was not our strength, it was pure circumstances. Hashgacha pointed me here. I used the phrase that I felt like being driftwood. The water pushes me to one side of the lake or the ocean, another side. I had no control. I was not navigating anything. It wasn't done by us or by me. And we were the beneficiaries of that, somebody's decisions, which were done behind our backs. We weren't consulted, obviously. But as a survivor of being a survivor, I had to work at that. And I think I feel relieved that I did succeed. The other issues which one can't help discuss is the challenge of faith. which Shoah survivors went through. Many, many people who survived the war were concerned of how to reconcile their experience with the religious beliefs and reliance and hope of God. And people asked, where was God? Why didn't he do something? And those are questions which are not easy to dismiss. And as I grew up, those things also circulated upstairs. And it is difficult to answer and blame those people who gave up their religion. Many even were people from very devout parents, very religious backgrounds and educated, and they dismissed everything or most everything from the religion. And the answer is not easy to defend, but the big question naturally is, denying God doesn't dismiss the question of why did this happen? Why was it allowed to happen by other people? If you're a liberal, why didn't the socialists and everybody else do more? Why didn't the American citizens do more? Why didn't the British bend and allow people to go to Palestine when it should have happened? And those people are not asking those questions necessarily as a counter item. But, moreover, it is not illegitimate to raise questions. In our own tefillot and our services, we ask all kinds of questions. Moshe himself asked questions. Avraham started with questions. Moshe asked questions. The Nevi'im asked questions. And in our tefillot, keynote, you count how often the word lama from Ad Mosai appears. They were challenging. Now the formula Chazal use is if you complain to God on behalf of the Kalal, it's okay. If you complain to God in a nasty way about yourself, perhaps that is not appropriate. But anyway, those people who did not handle the religious challenge the way I did, I don't want to prejudge them, as we say in Perek Beit of this coming Shabbat, Al tadid chavercha ad shetagia bimkomo. Don't make that judgment loosely. I was fortunate, I had a good education, Jewish education, and these issues were discussed in the literature as I grew up, and I overcame that stumbling item. The other few observations is that because of the experience we've had in the war, there's an increased need for people to have a feeling for Jewish suffering in particular and suffering in general. And the Jews have come through quite often very successfully in case of Russian Jewry, and in some case of people helping the Ethiopians. But there's a lot of Jewish suffering, whether it's poverty or anti-Semitism or what have you, and we have to speak up and have a feeling to be part of that item, because again, not everybody did demonstrate that they had a sense of responsibility to share in dealing with the suffering of the Jews. The other lesson I derive from the war is the value of having a country such as Eretz Israel. We didn't have in the war period or before the war period, places to go. Now we have a open entry to a country which is willing to take everybody and anybody who wants to come, especially if they're persecuted, especially if they're out of the way. And I recall quite vividly, November 29th in New York, I was at Mincha in a shul because what was happening at Lake Success that afternoon was still Shabbat, and a man comes running in to the shul who happened to have his radio on, at home most probably, and says, yes, we have a state coming. And all the discussion and Zemirot stopped, and there was happy singing in the shul. But what's even more interesting was at night there was a spontaneous outpouring of Jews coming to the Biltmore Hotel area in New York, and people were dancing in the streets, and people, I noticed myself, but also it was reported that a high proportion of those who were participating in this spontaneous celebration were people ניצול שואה. Therefore, we have to protect Israel's status, defend it, and we can't afford to lose a country which is now a haven spot for Jews, and we are faced with additional fears where this may well happen. The other point of commemorating the Shoah at a session like over here or what happened throughout the day is that at a time when there is Holocaust denial, we have to speak up, and I as a survivor have to speak up and bear witness, and the new generation has to take the baton for the next round because the statements that the world has learned is not being proved at this time. The current headlines from here or there, close by or further out, do not demonstrate that people have actually learned that anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews is gone and cured. I was told this morning that the Jerusalem Post had an article about the ignorance or non-awareness of Holocaust facts or so in the United States, with high proportions of people, but all adults or adults from 18 to 39, never heard of the word Auschwitz. And there are other statistics of the survey which are very, very disturbing. And unfortunately, besides the denial, we have our own cases where people feel that maybe we have overstated the Holocaust. Too much attention is being paid among our own Jews, particularly the younger generations. They ask, Ma havodah zot lachem? Why are you so much obsessed? America is good. Other countries are good and comfortable, and leave us alone already. Enjoy the fruits of living in places that the good life exists. And this doesn't bode well for the future if the items are so. In the discussion of the religious loss of faith, I must say that if we use our tefillot and refer to them, we have a very interesting tefillah on Monday and Thursday. at the end of Tachanun on Monday or Thursday, there are two stanzas that start off with a Habeit Mishamayim Urei Ki Ayinu La'ag V'kelas Bagoyim Nechshavnu Ketzon Latevach Yuval L'harot Ula'abeit L'makah L'cherpa. And then that is as we call of how we're being mistreated and maligned, humiliated, like sheep going to the slaughter. And that was being experienced in the 1100s when this apparently was written. And then there's a very interesting phrase. It says, V'chol zod lo shachachnu. Despite all of that, we have not forgotten you. Your name have not been forgotten you. No al tishkachenu. Please, God, don't forget us. And this powerful phrase appears in another stanza as well. If this was integrated in our tefillos, we certainly have to be aware for people who don't have it. My final comment is that really we are all survivors. Had the war gone the other direction, there were times when it was going the other direction. Step by step, we would have been extinguished as a nation. And these people living now, second or third generation, therefore are beneficiaries of somebody surviving and the war being won, and the Germans losing. But it was not such a definitive item. I'm sorry I've gone over time. There time for questions? Yes.
Could you just tell us that you got to America, but then what happened? You know, when did you get here? How did you get here? What happened?
Well, I got to America. We got to America. My brother, myself, to this family, my uncle. They had 6 children, and they were generous enough to take 2 more in. They had 6 children, and there were 2 children taken, and we're very grateful for the kindness, and was a comfortable life, had a family, had some normality. And I was educated in the United States. I went to yeshiva, I went to graduate school, I had a wonderful professional life. I have no complaints of fashion. And I'm married to a wonderful wife. And have children and grandchildren, of whom I'm proud. Even have a great granddaughter who was listening for part of the items too. And I have children in the Israeli army. And the fact that I live in Israel for the past 15 years or so much was a big privilege. And I enjoy every bit of it. Yes?
Two things. First, we visited Theresienstadt, and the last sentence that you ended with, we saw that in what was called
The hidden synagogue.
Big red letters as if it was written in blood, in what was called a
Hidden synagogue, right.
Was that a hidden shul, or was that the shul that you went to?
No, that didn't exist. My time, it wasn't known. It was only known to the workers who worked in that little area.
So it was hidden. You didn't go to that.
No, that was not the issue. Correct. I meant to guide. Correct. That phrase appears among others. There was a chazan who was made to work in fixing up certain buildings, and the people who worked over there apparently realized that when you work in daytime, you want to daven mincha. You need a place. It was nice to have a place, so they dug up this room, and he drew the paintings with many psukim, and that is one of them. Absolutely correct. Thank you.
The thing is, this song that you mentioned, I know that I've heard you say, would it be asking too much if you could just give us a refrain of those 2 songs, because those songs mean much.
Well, it may mean to you, I don't know, people are ready to go. So please, I'll sing the the round. Shomer Yisrael, Shemor Shedich Yisrael, V'al Yovat Yisrael, Omrim Shema Yisrael. Then the round go. Another group start singing this, and ha na 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 na. You're asking for two. Sing. Okay, thank you for listening, and